I'm going to share with you how I set up my Canon EOS R camera for the best cinematic look. So the number one thing that I set up on my camera is the white balance. The lighting that I'm using is affecting directly how I set up the white balance. For example, if I record videos right here in this room, I use an LED light, the Aperture 120D Mark II. This light has a fixed temperature of 5500 Kelvin. So I will set up a custom white balance on my camera with the same value. So on my Canon EOS R, I enter the quick settings, choose the white balance, then go to the next page and choose this icon right here. I can then choose any value that I want, but if I want to match my main light Kelvin value, I will choose 5500. But if you don't have a light yet, you can just record yourself near a window. Just make sure you choose a time of the day when you don't stay in direct sunlight, because that will create a very contrasty look with harsh shadows. Just wait until you have soft shadows coming from the window, and this way you can use natural light, which is free, by the way. In this case, I would recommend using the auto white balance if you're just talking to the camera. That will be perfect if you're a beginner, for example. On the EOS R, the auto white balance is actually the first icon from the white balance menu, and it's marked with AWB, automatic white balance. And if you want to maintain a constant white balance, you can easily get away with the cloudy setting in the white balance menu, or you can use a smartphone app called LSP Evo. So when you point the phone's camera to the area that you will be sitting in when recording the video, you'll see an approximate white balance value, which you can enter then as a custom number in the camera. Number 2 on the list is the frame rate. Now, I usually record videos at 24 frames per second because this offers a more cinematic look if you're using the correct shutter speed value, which I'm going to mention in this video. So, movies or TV series are actually recorded in 24 frames per second. To be more exact, in 23.976 frames per second. And that's because the human eye can perceive a smooth, fluid motion at a minimum of 24 frames per second. On the other hand, TV shows, reality shows, or sometimes documentaries are filmed in 30 frames per second because that's giving you a feeling of a much more fluid scene. Unfortunately, I cannot show you this test in this video because I'm recording right now at 24 frames per second. But feel free to try it for yourself and see the differences between 24 and 30 frames per second. I'm sure you will find a difference. So on my Canon EOS R, from the quick menu, I can access the resolution settings on the left column, then I enter movie recording size and choose Full HD 23.98 frames per second, all I if I want the highest bitrate, which means higher quality. Or I can also choose 4K at 23.97 frames per second, all I if I want the highest quality possible on this camera. For slow motion, you should be choosing the Full HD 59.94 frames per second, so almost 60 frames per second. Now keep in mind that this frame rate will require to slow down the footage using software like Premiere Pro or Final Cut. You cannot just do it in camera. So number 3 on the list is the shutter speed, which on video is so important if you want to maintain a cinematic motion blur through the video, throughout the frames. And here is the correct way to set the shutter speed when recording videos. You should always have the shutter speed at double of your frame rate. For example, if you're shooting at 24 FPS, the shutter speed should be at 1/50th of a second. At 30 FPS, the shutter speed should be at 1/60th of a second, and so on. Always the double of the frame rate. It's so easy to remember. When shooting indoors, it's so easy to keep control over these values, but outside on a sunny day, good luck with that because you'll end up with an overexposed footage, especially when you're using an aperture like f1.8 or f1.4, for example. This is why you will need to use an ND filter on your lens because this will limit the amount of light that's entering the sensor. It's just like a pair of sunglasses that helps you control the exposure of the shot. And by the way, if you find some value here in this video, just make sure you hit the thumbs up because that would be awesome. Okay, number 4 is the aperture. On the Canon EOS R, you'll find it at the bottom of the screen near the shutter speed function. And of course, I can either use the touch screen or the buttons to change the values. This should be set depending on how much from the scene you want to be in focus. But in the same time, this depends on the capabilities of the lens. Some lenses are going down to f1.2, and that means you will have a very blurry background. The lens that I use right now is a 35mm RF Canon lens, and the aperture is set to f1.8 because I want some blur in the background. But there are other lenses that start at f4, and this means you'll not have a very blurry background, and you'll need to have enough light in the room to get a good exposure. I mean, outside it's not a problem, but indoors you'll definitely need a light, or you will need to raise the ISO, which we'll talk about in a second. It's so simple. You want a blurry background, use the lowest aperture value available, f1.4, f1.8, f2.8, and so on. You want more objects in focus, use an f4, f8, or f11. And also make sure you remember that aperture affects how much light is entering the sensor of the camera. Okay, number 5 on my list is the ISO. The ISO helps you to introduce more artificial light on the sensor of the camera. So, depending on the power of the light that you're using indoors or the time of the day when you're shooting outside, maybe it's early in the morning before sunrise or after the sunset, you may need to adjust the ISO value to have a good exposure. I usually keep my ISO between 200 and 800 when filming videos like this, and I can change this value very easily using the touchscreen of the camera. But just like I said, I use a Canon EOS R at the moment, and it's pretty good in low light, so I can use higher ISO values without getting too much noise in the footage, because that's what's happening when you're raising the ISO. You artificially introduce more brightness into the scene that comes together with some noise. So all you need to understand is this: the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO have one element in common, and that is exposure. They control the lightness of a scene, and you need to understand them one by one. This is why I created this video that will teach you how to get the perfect exposure every single time when recording videos using 5 powerful tools. So, I'm Chris, go watch that video.